as you know, it's not the entangled that you can disentangle. It's really that its inherent nature is entangled in the sense that we don't have these clear-cut boundaries, this more modular view that has been so prevalent, so dominant in neuroscience for forever. Because the connectivity is so massive, it helps us understand that we need to go moving away from a space of anatomical connectivity to a space of functional relationships. But if we want to solve problems that are similar to what embodied animals solve in intelligent ways, I think we need to solve a couple of problems that bring us to emotion. And here's my way of thinking. My way of thinking is that
this is Brain Inspired.
That was Luiz Pessoa. Luiz is a professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he runs his Laboratory of Cognition and Emotion. His latest book is The Entangled Brain: How Perception, Cognition, and Emotion Are Woven Together, which is aimed at a more general audience. In broad strokes, the book argues that we need to move past the traditional modular view of the brain, which is still prevalent. You still come across statements like brain area X does cognitive function Y, or, for example, the amygdala does emotion, and so on. But instead, we should account for the highly interactive and integrative functional organization of the brain. So we discuss some of the implications of approaching the brain from a complex systems perspective, some of the principles of organization within brains that Luiz believes will help reshape how we study and understand brains and brain function. And Luiz has long been interested in the interaction between emotion and cognition, which you can learn more about in his previous, more technical book, The Cognitive Emotional Brain. So we discuss emotion and cognition and why emotion might be important for artificial intelligence. And we discuss a lot more as well. Many of Luiz's ideas are in line with those of Michael Anderson, who's been on the show recently. So if you liked that recent episode with Michael Anderson, you'll probably like this one as well. Show notes are at braininspired.co/155, where you can also learn how to support the show through Patreon. Thank you to my incredible Patreon supporters. Okay, here's Luiz. Luiz, the book is The Entangled Brain: How Perception, Cognition, and Emotion Are Woven Together. And there's a lot, the book does a lot, and there's a lot for us to talk about. One thing maybe I would just start with is that I find the structure of the book interesting, because you go from a modular descriptions of the brain, and you're warning the reader the entire time that you'll eventually destroy that modular view.
yeah.
And then you build up from what you describe as a minimal brain to more complex modular view of the brain, tracking evolution along the way.
Right.
And then you come to the destroying part, where you argue for new ways to think about how to connect brains and behavior. So that's a lot to unpack right there. But maybe we'll just start with the title. Why entangled? Why the word entangled?
Right. So, but let me just say one thing before that the structure of the book is something interesting. I really struggled with, because I wanted to write a book to a general audience. I did not want to write. I had written a book many years ago, 10 years ago or so, that was for a specialized audience, and it was fine. It was published, and I think it's a fine book. But what I really wanted was to write something that sort of reminded me, like when I was an adolescent and reading books, I was really into physics and math and other things. And I would read these books that I thought was really fascinating about really super complex topics. I don't know, like advanced physics and whatnot, that obviously I was not even in college. So I wanted to write something that perhaps could resonate with someone like me at whatever number of years ago, many decades ago. So I really struggled on how to write it, and I did definitely want to write it for a general audience. So I decided to not start with something like about complexity theory and build it from there, and even leave the entire past behind and just forget about a more modular view of the brain. I
But
wanted
was
to.
that a struggle for you to do that? Because
No,
you're sort of, okay.
no. Actually, somehow it was natural. It was natural, but I don't know if it worked, because I'll tell you a couple of things. One, I'll tell you in part because it's a little delicate. The, an initial set of reviewers was really confused about it. Said this book is not working because you are suggesting this is a complex system. This is an entangled brain. That, going back to your original question of entangled, the idea is that this is kind of intertwined to the extent that we don't have these clear-cut boundaries between these standard domains that we always talk about: perception, cognition, emotion, motivation, action, and so on. And I wanted to have a framework that would sort of dissolve these boundaries. And at one point, I was, what's the title? And brain networks, the network brain, the highly network brain. I mean, that just didn't really work. And the network brain had been something that people had been talking about for 10, 20 years even. And I threw it out on Twitter, of all things. And
Oh,
there were suggestions, and among one of the suggestions, to be honest, I don't even remember if I said is entangled good or someone suggested entangled. I think more likely someone literally suggested, how about entangled? And I said, oh, that's perfect. So in a way, it is perfect because I view it. I think it's quite adequate, but it's as you know, it's not the entangled that you can disentangle, like some knot that you're going to disentangle and, oh, I fixed it now and it's all crystal clear and unentangled, disentangled. It's really that its inherent nature is entangled, in the sense that we don't have these clear-cut boundaries, this more modular view that has been so prevalent, so dominant in neuroscience for forever, for a very long time. That being said, that obviously since the historical beginnings of neuroscience, there's always movements for networked views from the very beginning, and more anti-localizationist views. So it's this continuum swing of a pendulum, going more modular, more distributed. The extreme would be something like Lashley's equipotential views, that it doesn't matter what you take out, scoop out, is just proportional to the volume that you take out, which is obviously not the case. So yeah, long answer there. Entangled is really an idea to try to move us away from thinking, having almost this reflexive way of thinking about the brain in this very modular, clockwork, machine-like type of analogy that we often make. So that was the goal, is to have a title, and someone there were some suggestions, and I think that worked well.
Oh, I was all set to congratulate you on coming up with a new term that fits. But you don't even know if I should be congratulating you, because you outsourced it, and you don't know.
No, I think it's even better. It's outsourced. I think it was the collective there. It's so.
So going back to the structure, it surprises me. Well, your answer surprised me that it was really about reflecting on your journey and your early fascination with these kinds of works. You just mentioned that the modular view is the reflexive kind of view. And I thought it was maybe based on that, because that's where we all kind of start, right?
Yeah.
And it's like the most natural. Yeah. And it's kind of unnatural to start or just to think in terms of complexity and those sorts of issues that complexity brings up. So I thought maybe that's why you wrote it like that.
No, it is. It is that I think you're right. No, you're right. I wrote it like that because of this way that we're taught, but that it's very natural for people to think, at least in the West, and the way people think in the Western world. I think that somehow is very natural. And I was part of a very large group of people at the University of Maryland trying to create an institute at some point, starting maybe 10 or so years ago. and there were people from the humanities, and we would often start talking about the brain. And when people would talk about the brain, it was so natural for them to think, okay, this part of the brain does this function, and this other part does this function. So if you have this problem in the amygdala or in this other region, you can be anxious, or you can. So it was so natural for them to think in that way, that I just wanted to convey something that we would try to break this naturalness. And if I started from, okay, there are all these physicists and mathematicians that created all these complex systems and dynamical systems theory, and let's just adopt that, and that's chapter 0, and then we build from here. I think I would lose the ability or the possibility of sort of pushing back, like, okay, we have these areas. Okay, but what really are areas? I mean, what do they compute? Do they compute one function? Is it one-to-one mapping? Is it one to many, many to many? What kind of functional repertoire areas have? How do we think about areas? And what are even areas? How do we find boundaries, and how do we define them? So the breaking was part of the process of building it. But I do think that my first drafts, complete worked out drafts, left that a little bit not well worked out enough that the reviewers had problems. And I think in part it was justifiable, just more than justifiable. And so I went back and I kept on, like you said, I kept on reminding the reader that we're going to break it, we're going to break it, we're going to break it, so that it seemed to have some flow, perhaps unusual or unexpected, but that at least didn't leave the reader confused about, well, there was all this modular stuff, and then you turn to complex systems in chapter, emergent behaviors in chapter 8. Shouldn't that be chapter 1? I mean, there was some chapter 2. Some reviewers said this should be chapter 2. Yeah.
When did you break yourself? And are you comfortable now? Oh, go ahead. Answer that, and then I have a follow-up.
No, I mean, actually, to me, it's coming back home in a way. So to me, it's the opposite. And obviously, neuroscience is large enough and diverse enough that there are multiple views. This view could be very productive, or perhaps not, because the modular view is defended by many people still. So I'm not saying that we should just completely abandon it. So, and I'm not saying that I'm having this vision from early on that was ahead of my time, but I started from that perspective because I started reading things like Dennett and the Mind's Eye, and then I did my PhD in the Department of Cognitive and Neurosystems at Boston University with Grossberg's group, and so everything was already, and I was really into reading about dynamical systems. I was doing a major in computer science and math, and many of my closest friends were doing honors thesis or already in graduate school doing something on dynamical systems. And so that's sort of the parallel distributed processing was something that in a sense seemed natural to me, and then it got only solidified with my PhD. And so when I went away from computational neuroscience after my PhD to more experimental neuroscience, it's when I really got to learn more how biologists and neuroscientists in particular think. And I learned of this way of bringing things a little closer in terms of the mappings, one-to-one, or perhaps not exactly one-to-one, but where a double dissociation type of experiment, when you do these lesions and you investigate the respective types of deficits, it can lead to more conclusive statements about the specificity of the deficit and the way the areas carry out, or parts of the brain carry out specific functions. So I really learned these things after, in more depth, at the very least, after graduate school. And I started learning this vocabulary and this way of thinking. And so it's kind of, the book is kind of going back all the way to my first readings about, I don't know, I should take a look again, the chapters in The Mind's Eye. Do you know that book by Dennett, edited by Dennett and Hofstadter, that has all these essays on collective behaviors and termite colonies and how do they implement things or carry out behaviors in the system-oriented distributed way, and things like that was basically the first few essays that I was reading in the very, very early days of starting to think about the brain and learning about the brain.
Well, once you do get to the, we're just going to jump around. So
Sure.
once you do get to the complexity parts later in the book, you list some of the principles or implications for how to think about brains based on it being a complex system. And I'm going to list them off here, and then I want to ask you a follow-up question. So I think you list 5 or 6. So
Yeah.
Interactions between parts, levels of analysis, dynamics. We have to think of over time as in a processual way. Decentralization, and use the word heterarchy, which is not to be confused with hierarchy.
Right.
You want to define heterarchy for us real quick?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think heterarchy is just, it's really in my view, it's the absence of any clear-cut hierarchy. It's just when thinking hierarchically is not a constructive way of thinking.
Yeah, I think that Michael Anderson used that term when I had him on the podcast a while back also. And then emergence and complexity. And, I buy into all of these things. But what I want, and maybe we can dive into, more of them individually. But what I struggle with is to think of them, maybe because I'm from the Western world, I don't know, sort of holistically and have them all in mind when I'm thinking about a cognitive function or a brain area or process. So have you said it's kind of natural for you and you're coming back to that way of thinking after, learning more. But do you feel comfortable, like when you think about, well, let's say emotion or something new that you learn about, can you bring all of these implications or principles to bear on the problem in a sort of holistic way, or do you kind of step through them and think about them in slices?
Right.
How do you? Because I'm not comfortable yet having them all in mind.
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I wouldn't claim that it's natural in some instinctive sense. I think that I wasn't exposed to some types of solutions that neuroscientists had considered and had thought about at the very, very beginning. I mean, I was being exposed at the same time to these multiple ideas. So I always thought that it basically, to a large extent, they're empirical questions. So it's how is this implemented in the mammalian brain or in humans versus mice? So there could be some more modular solutions to a problem in some species for some types of functions or not. So it's something that I'm not saying that it's a type of reasoning or a type of thinking or a type of architecture, I should say, that is completely non-existent. But I think that I always thought in terms of a spectrum of ways of being organized, from very hierarchical, let's say visual cortex goes to thalamus, and thalamus goes to V1, and V1 goes to V2, and V2 goes to V4, and V4 goes to IT, and so on, all down the line. And then association areas, and association areas have some fibers all the way to prefrontal cortex, to an apex region, all the way there, where everything comes together and is put together in a way that reflects your past experience, your current experience, and perceptual, and puts everything together, right? Puts everything together.
Yeah.
So that could be how the brain works. And it could be even somehow how some brains work. But I was always attracted to the multiple types of solutions because, for instance, I started seeing that I had a lot of colleagues in Brazil. I'm originally from Brazil, and I had a lot of colleagues and mentors in Brazil originally that were doing a lot of work on anatomy and the physiology of the visual system. And in fact, they happened to be collaborating very strongly with Leslie Ungerleider from the National Institute of Mental Health. And long story short, that's why I ended up doing a postdoc there. But they were finding all these bypass connections from V2, it goes all the way to IT, and from, so these parallel type of processing was also very evident. And And because I was sort of in a computer science type of background, and we were talking about, a lot about in the end of the 80s about these parallel architectures, it seemed natural. And so that's the sense I think that I think about being natural. But going back to your question about how do I put all of them together, I don't think I put them all of them together at the same time, but I view them as more guiding principles. Every time that I'm trying to think of something and I start to think of something too much as a thing in itself, I remind myself, okay, but it's always temporal. So we should try to let go of that and think of it more as a process. So where's time in this? How does it evolve? What sort of trajectory does it, in some state space type of situation scenario, does it evolve through or along? And so this is in one part of in the space of those concepts that you mentioned, the time and process part. The hierarchy it's partly hierarchical, but it's to a good extent also violating hierarchy. The latency across the visual system all the way to frontal eye fields and whatnot completely violates the sequential propagation of signals. So, okay, that means that in addition to this, to an existing and undeniable possibility of sequential processing, there are other forms of processing that are happening in parallel together with feedback, because we know those exist. They're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, they're an underlying characteristic of the architecture itself. So kind of reminding yourself of these things, that at every time that you think that it's something in more of one of the ends of the spectrum, from modular to distributed to more linear to nonlinear to simple to complex, sort of spanning this range of possible architectures that different brains might carry out. But I do think that these questions have to be empirical, right? So a lot of my colleagues really think that there's just a lot of hand waving saying the kinds of things that we say. I completely understand that. I do think that there is at least an equivalent amount of hand waving in the other direction, because okay, so like I literally just shared this question on Twitter the other day. So exactly what is an area? So we don't even know how to define an area. So it's, if we an area is defined by a multivariate, by a multiple set of criteria, the borders don't coincide exactly if it's cell density or if it's receptor density, if it's gene expression, if it's connection, there are these gradients and whatnot. So some people say, okay, there are gradients, and so it's not exactly a sharp boundary. But I do think that both ends, there has to be pushback, because both ends seem to be having to address important questions. And I think that the standard story claims that more distributed processing, emergent type of processing, is hand waving. But I kind of see the equivalent on the other side of things. But I mean, that's my view, at least.
So I'm not sure where I want to go with this, but okay. You mentioned frontal eye fields, which was one of my areas of expertise, right? And you know how it gets spikes occur in it earlier than you would think if the brain was strictly hierarchical, and you know that's been known for some time. But then, so frontal eye field projects to superior colliculus, another brain area. And then probably because my training, I think, superior colliculus, it does blank, right? It's involved in attention, eye movements, orienting, fight or flight, all the stuff. And you talk about it a lot when you describe the minimal brain
right.
Early on in the book. But that's my natural inclination, is to think, okay, well, what does it mean? Or that frontal eye field gets early skip connections from, whatever, V1, let's say. Okay, well, V1 does this early. So that's like my natural inclination. And do you still think that way at all? Like, well, what does it mean that superior colliculus, an area, and frontal eye field, an area, are connected, right?
No, so I don't.
Do you think like frontal eye field does this, superior colliculus does that, or have you thrown that away from your thinking?
No, I don't think I think that way. I would say at all, but maybe I'll back. Yeah, I think it's possibly at all, but let me think through as I answer. Because I always think in terms of circuits. So, for instance, the superior colliculus is embedded in some kind of circuit together with the striatum or something, or the midbrain or some other kind of a circuit that it forms momentarily, depending on the behavioral needs and requirements. And so I mean, I think it has some kind of flavors. I think like Michael Anderson said a few weeks ago in one of your sessions, that it really momentarily forms, the circuit momentarily forms. It doesn't mean that the superior colliculus or any other region has infinite capacity to implement anything, depending on that very same moment created from nothing, creates some new kind of function in the context of that circuit. It does have some clear flavors of type of processing, given its connectivity, given its types of receptors, given the types of, obviously the inputs and outputs are completely determined, or I should say are incredibly important in determining the kinds of things that the signals, it determines the signals that it receives and what it can influence, obviously, by definition. So it's not that it has an infinite capacity to carry out any function. It obviously has some flavor, some kind of repertoire that has some theme to it. And I think that sometimes the theme can be quite complex and can be quite multivariate in the sense that it can span quite different things. But nonetheless, it doesn't have this complete flexibility. That's a fact. That's clear. But I do think, when I do think in terms of a region, I think of it, what circuit is it embedded into? And what's the role of the amygdala or the subnucleus of the amygdala, let's say, now that it's actually really important in this circuit for unlearning some relationship that it had learned before, that some stimulus was fear evoking, fear inducing, or threat related. And now it's participating, these other circuits are participating in some other circuit that actually is about the unlearning this relationship. So of course the complexity is there, different subpopulations of neurons, and that's a lot of things need to be worked out. But to the extent that we think of a little bit more macro regions, even sub-regions being considered in this context macro enough, I'm thinking that they exert their functions as a function of the coalition of regions it's grouped with, that it creates this ensemble with, momentarily in the function of solving some behavioral problem.
One answer to the question I'm about to ask you, one great answer, is read my book, because in large part, your book does begin to train one's mind on how to think from, that more complex systems theory perspective. But do you have actionable advice on students, who come up in what is still, I suppose, the dominant paradigm in neuroscience and thinking in this modular fashion, of how to train themselves to get out of that way of thinking and come over to the Luiz Pessoa side?
Yeah, right. I think that it's really important to be exposed, and I think more and more people are being exposed to ideas of complex science and network science, right? So that's something that has clearly changed in the past 20 years. Let
me interrupt you.
Yeah,
is that true? Because I was talking with a friend and someone prominent in neuroscience, and they said that they think it's getting worse. That not necessarily just the modular view, but that sort of A connects to B, and so A does this. That is actually getting worse in neuroscience, and that's not my view. But I don't know. I'm kind of in the bubble that you're in.
I think those two statements could be correct at the same time. I don't in the following sense, in the sense that perhaps neuroscience training is still very much like that. But for instance, sometimes when I'm teaching a class, a course on functional MRI or some other course that I teach, I ask sometimes when I introduce these concepts a little bit about if I happen to discuss this in the course. I always am curious to ask them, because I'm teaching students from psychology, and some are from a neuroscience major and some are even from other majors, but there are many from psychology, and so they don't come from let's say a physics background. So I always ask them, have you encountered these kinds of ideas? And many of them mention environmental sciences, studying ecology and some other things that they might have studied, but also have heard of this via reading books or reading other things from other areas. So not necessarily about the brain, but the interconnected economy or interconnected water and food supply systems of the entire planet or what have you, and how these interdependencies are highly complex, and how this breaks a little bit this the linear way of thinking that is, again, I think is supernatural for everyone. So I do think that because of this wave of network science, that at least in terms of popularizing some of these ideas with books that were quite popular and is sold extremely well, and were I think influential in the general audience education about some of these ideas. I think that has happened to a greater extent than perhaps when I was at that same stage of going to going to college, or in the early years of being in college. Had I not been in computer science and thinking about distributed architectures, because I happened to be immersed in some environment that one of my mentors had studied AI and was trying to I was doing an internship, and a buddy of mine, friend of mine, I was doing computer graphics related things, and he was doing AI, and we were talking about these architectures, these AI, distributed architectures for AI. So supercomputers were becoming really a notion that was starting to pick up in the 80s. And so I think so. Going back to your question, I think my suggestion is really to try to find ways of reading some of these, this, I wouldn't say literature, because finding books that discuss these issues about highly interactive, complex systems, and exposing oneself to these ways of thinking that are perhaps a little different from it's something that we learn in high school. We don't learn quite so much about that, perhaps, unless someone's taking some classes in environmental science, and environmental science starting to get a lot to those issues, because they start talking about water cycles and population dynamics and other kinds of problems that map into these kinds of formalisms. So
sorry to keep this kind of high level because I want to get into more concrete topics in the book, but one of the, so I've had Eve Marder on, and I know that you know Eve Marder's work, and one of the things that she has discovered is that there's this that structure does not dictate function. It's necessary for function, but it's not sufficient, right? So you can have one structure and multiple different functions. And this is also connected to, your ideas about interacting brain parts and the neural reuse ideas and coalitions that evolve over time. And I think when I first, came across these kinds of ideas, my first reaction was, oh, this is a problem, because it makes it more complicated, and it's a problem relative to the way that, I've been taught neuroscience. Region A does this, region B does that. But then I thought, no, this is actually, I started to think maybe this is more like a solution, but it's not really a solution so much as a principle. I think what I'm trying to say is that these kinds of principles, as I sit with them over time, I get more and more comfortable with them as being an answer instead of a problem, or, at least like toward a solution or a direction. But in some sense, oh, this is a productive solution, not a roadblock to understanding. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. But I think that there's one challenge that feels like a roadblock, which is
just one.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Like one, yeah. Well, there's a clear one, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I haven't been able to still put on paper, and but a lot of other people have been writing about, which is many of these systems are incredibly context dependent. So I'm not just talking about the brain, I'm talking about these complex systems in general. And so that becomes a little bit of an important roadblock, I would say, because in science, we're trained to do the exact opposite, right? We abstract away context, we fix everything, and we study that system so that we can make conclusions. Because if everything is varying, I mean, we cannot conclude anything, because obviously causally, it just doesn't make sense, that kind of reasoning, right? At the first pass. But at the same time, if you're dealing with a system that is incredibly nuanced and sensitive to the specifics of the context, that this cue was encountered in the past, and together with other cues that signal that it's actually safe only in that context, but not in other contexts. So it starts behaving in very different ways that it's experimentally and theoretically become incredibly challenging. So I'm a big believer in this enormous context dependence of brain behavior. And it does feel daunting sometimes, because it feels that how do you make sense of this richness of expressions that would not be there were the system much less context dependent, right? So you drive a car, and your car is made to be relatively insensitive to lots of contextual differences. You don't want it to drive hugely different over gravel versus asphalt or what have you. Obviously it's different, but we engineer systems to be relatively, to buffer us from these contextual differences. It's raining a little bit. It shouldn't be a major problem. It isn't. So it's not a good example, but the kind of engineered systems that we engineer, that we create, are created for that to be as context independent as possible, or only depend on context when we really want, because, okay, you want to go really fast now, so press this button because you bought a super expensive car. I mean, maybe those exist. I don't have an expensive car. So, but yeah, there is contextual dependence, context dependency, but it's of a completely different qualitative nature than in biological systems. And I think that is something that is very difficult to wrap our heads around, because even our training as experimentalists tries to remove that. And so I don't think we're good. I don't think there's just period. We don't even have good ways of dealing with that. I think that we have to change the way we do quite a bit of our science and train in different ways, because we're abstracting too much of context, when in some sciences, I think context can be everything. And it's not just the brain. It's about ecological systems and many other complex systems that have these properties.
See, so now you were kind of a downer just now to me. You were raining on my parade, because especially with that example of context dependency and context sensitivity, because I've become to really appreciate context as, such a huge part, and that principle then allows me to take the next step and really appreciate that our brains and our behavior and, the context within we're operating, how it affects those things, that, oh, wow, that is an amazing principle that shows, the adaptability and plasticity of our abilities, right? And that itself is a glorifying principle.
Yeah.
But you say it's a roadblock.
No, I don't think I think that's why we exist, right? I mean, after these 1+ billion years, or if we just start 500 million years ago or whatever you want to
Sure.
start, where you want to start, it's hundreds of millions of years that led to this kind of architecture, these kinds of architectures of all species, existing species on the planet. But for us to study that in a way that is based on a standard way of thinking that is largely driven by, or to a good extent, at the very least, driven by how physicists have been thinking for the past several centuries, and how engineering has been so successful in the past 100 plus years. And so I think that way of thinking is very different from a way of thinking that would be productive in other kinds of sciences. So I do think that we need to kind of a reset button, perhaps not reset button, but let's shift this the other direction button, and get started in ways of thinking that we just embrace this adaptiveness, this plasticity, this complexity, the temporal dimensions, the lack of clear-cut hierarchies, and this naturally interacting nature that sort of determines how many systems work.
In the startup world, that's called a pivot. If you want a new term, we can pivot.
That is that's a great word. Yeah, we really need a good pivot there. Yeah.
So I actually had a quote from your book in my notes here, and since we were talking about context, this will segue into our next little topic here. We can think. So this is from the book. We can think of the brain with all its different parts as evolution's solution to the problem of uncoupling inputs from outputs. This observation reflects a fundamental principle of brain function, context sensitivity. See, you didn't call it a roadblock there. You called it a fundamental principle. Anyway.
Well, no, but that's what I'm saying, right? It's actually a fundamental principle that poses a huge challenge for us as external observers of these systems to work out exactly what's happening. So I think it's really fundamental to the existence of these biological systems. But for the experimenter, the scientist in all of us doing this, it's a roadblock in the sense that we're not even well prepared to think of it that way. First thing that we do is fix context. Like if you just tremendous advances in learning, in memory, fear learning, and other kinds of things, decades of research. The main goal is to fix the context and it's literally like I say in the book, is a little box that you put the animal and everything is restricted. And there were other kinds of approaches, more ethological approaches that were trying to see what happens in more natural environments, but they didn't take off because it's incredibly challenging. We can't have a forest here and study animals doing their natural thing. It's just not going to, and there are too many things that we can't control. So what conclusions do we make? So we start from the premise that we need to limit the amounts of things that can happen if we're going to conclude anything. But if that's not a good model for studying this kind of system, and that's up for debate, right? Obviously, people are going to say, no, this is still a really good way. And this is completely defensible and reasonable way of thinking. But if not, then we are kind of in trouble, because doing this research, for instance, in rodents, which is incredibly important for many decades in an enclosed box, might have really incredibly limited the kinds of conclusions that we can make that actually apply to more real world settings. Hopefully not, because we hopefully not. And again, that largely is an empirical thing that we're going to discover as we create more neurotechniques that can be more open-ended, more naturalistic environments, that have the animals just navigating and living the way that they live outside the lab.
Yeah, you make more arguments like this in a recent paper. I don't have it in front of me, but where you argue that neuroscience needs to become a study of more complex behaviors as well because of this kind of context sensitivity, and you use threat assessment and other examples. And I've seen you use it in multiple different places, but as this reason why we need to think about both brain function and complex behaviors in these context-sensitive kinds of terms, because they can change depending on all the factors going on.
Yeah, I mean, my own education was one in which I was never exposed to these ideas because I didn't study psychology and I didn't study the whole breadth of methods and approaches. So I wasn't familiar with these approaches until more recently, maybe 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit more ethological types of approaches that really take the animals' natural behaviors in their natural habitats as the basis of studying behavior and the organization of behavior. So I was not very highly educated in all of this type of thinking. And it just resonated completely with me because I said, yeah, that's exactly how we need to do it. I mean, that's not to say that we can do it because we just don't have the techniques, right? It's easy to say, well, I like to study a troop of 50 baboons with this complex hierarchy and having these kinds of fights and this kind of sexual behavior and this kind of food gathering thing, and all in real time. Well, yeah, everyone wants that too, but obviously we can't do that.
Take your notebook and pen out there and really look around fast. Take a lot of notes.
Yeah. I mean, people have done these amazing things, but what I meant is that we're not having the neural recordings at the same time that we're recording all the behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, maybe one day the water that they drink leads to some net of sensors.
Neural dust.
Yeah. Some magic dust you throw their way, and that sends signals back of all the neurons in their brain, and then we can have that in I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. Would we even know what to do with it? Is the perennial question, right? So but and that's what these things are getting at. That's what the topics in your book are getting at, and these principles. Well, maybe we could frame how to attack these problems using these. Like dynamical systems theory, which is already being done a lot, and these other topics. Anyway, I read that quote before because it had the word evolution in it. And one of the things that you do in the book is that you use evolution and comparative anatomy and changes in brain organization, not brain structure. You make the distinction between organization and structure in the book. What is the difference between organization and structure, and why do we need to think about organization instead of structure?
Yeah, because I do think, going back to the themes that we've been talking about, I do think that in the functional landscape or the functional domain of things, we need to be thinking about these circuits. And so these circuits will come about with these, in my view, to a large extent, with these large-scale distributed systems that the underlying architecture either provides or doesn't provide. Let's say there are several basal ganglia loops of certain kind in some species. Let's say amphibians, fishes, reptiles have loops through the basal ganglia that go to the ventral striatum. And only birds and mammals have, in addition to those loops, have another set of loops that go through the dorsal striatum, the dorsal parts of the striatum. So this is something that we don't know yet because we haven't been investigating this computationally and with the comparative anatomy and comparative physiology, which is, there's so little work on that, obviously, because of the challenges. So we don't know exactly what these structural components are enabling functionally, but it gives us clues that it's allowing novel functional repertoires or ways of processing that are not available in other species, in other taxonomic groups. So amphibians don't have that, so they will not be benefiting from this type of organization that mammals have, that mammals and birds both exhibit these kinds of loops. Or, for instance, we know and have been learning a lot about how the thalamus works in such close proximity and with cortex. Its thalamocortical processing is essentially something that has been known for quite some time, but it's been more and more well characterized and understood. And so these thalamocortical circuits, for instance, are something that is a property, again, not of all vertebrates. So understanding these kinds of structural components and their relationships and the pathways allows us to understand what kinds of functional organization they end up enabling or supporting. I mean, that's if that's the sense that you were referring to, organization and structure.
Yeah. Well, structure is just basic anatomy, right? But like I'm going to step through in a moment. You go through 5 principles of organization, and maybe we can just say a word about each of them. But you said thalamus. I thought you were going to go basal ganglia loops, and looking at you, amygdala loops, which we're learning more about, and the comparative anatomy and the evolutionary and the development of amygdala. Looking back, you talk about there specifically about amygdala, how they're, because it develops from different parts. We can think of part of the amygdala as closer to cortex, part of it is closer to a subcortical structure. So calling it the amygdala is kind of confusing in that respect. And these are based on the organizational principles of the loops that are coming through and the connections with other areas. Right. Mm-hmm. But okay, so maybe we could step through some of the principles. If you don't mind, we could step through some of the principles of organization that you write about in the book. And I mainly I wanted to mention the loops, since you mentioned thalamus, because you go into some detail in the book, if people want to learn more about the implications for the different loops and structures in the brain and that organization. Principle 1. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
I thought you were going. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so principle 1.
Oh no! I'll read it. You don't have to memorize. I got it right in front of me. I can do it. I'm not testing you here.
No, go ahead. No. Okay, go ahead.
That's staying in probably. Principle 1: massive combinatorial anatomical connectivity. So, and I'll just ask you to say a word about each of these as we go through.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that struck me incredibly, so around 15 years or so, I really started studying anatomy quite a bit, and anatomy of vertebrates across taxonomic groups, not just, let's say, humans or primates or even mammals. So one of the things that really struck me, and it continues to grow with this computational analysis of connectomes and other kinds of things, is really this incredible, massive backbone of connectivity that links in a very structured way. So it's not everything connects to all by any means. So it's extremely structured, but nonetheless, this enormous backbone of connectivity that creates this, what I was just terming, this kind of combinatorial ability of linking A to B via multiple ways, directly or indirectly, in all sorts of ways, that I think is so important, because it really helps us understand how because the connectivity is so massive, it helps us understand that we need to go from moving away from a space of anatomical connectivity to a space of functional relationships. Because doing my research and interacting with a lot of people in the area of emotion and cognition and things like that, there was always a lot of discussion that to me sounded a little confusing, because, for instance, the amygdala doesn't project very strongly. Parts of the basolateral amygdala and parts of the amygdala that connect to prefrontal cortex do not project very strongly at all to, let's say, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that worked perfectly, because in a way, emotion is in the amygdala, cognition is in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and they don't even talk to each other very much. But to me, because of this kind of anatomical properties, why does it have to be a direct connection? Okay, a direct connection is very powerful. No one is going to deny that. But nonetheless, one can drive from here to New York City in some straight line, and it gets me there a little bit quicker. But I can also go to Philadelphia and do what have you, and stop in and do something different on the way, then and it still get to the same place. So there are these multiple ways of signals propagating that I think we have to become a little bit more familiar with this way of thinking, that it's not that everything has a chance to influence everything at the same time and equally well, but there are ample opportunities of these signals to crisscross and mutually influence each other in many more ways than a direct inspection of the only strongest connections would indicate. So the first principle being this massive anatomical connectivity, but really having in mind another of the principles, which I think might be number 2, I can't remember the number, but it really is going into a functional space of relationships of these signals. You have these signals in the back of the brain, in the front of the brain. Perhaps there's no single one direct connection, and there isn't, but nonetheless, they're functionally coupled in ways that have to do with the current behaviors that an animal is doing at that time. And I think that's the space that we need to move to. And I feel sometimes that people are a little too bound by the anatomy. And for instance, they have studies that showing, functional connectivity in the resting state is really well predicted by the structural connectome. Okay, maybe that's true, but and not going to deny that it's going to constrain and impact it. But I think that we have to understand how it goes away from that basic set of functional relationships that are just driven by the sort of the direct pathways, the most strong pathways, or the ones that are in the more basic context, the more context independent ones, that a person is there and not doing some active behavior in the scanner, just to give an arbitrary example. So I view these two principles as really highly related. And I like to emphasize the connectivity one, because at least in my way of thinking has really influenced how I started to think and solidify some of these ideas, was by taking the anatomy seriously. If the anatomy is like this, and we're revealing all these principles of connectivity, of anatomical connectivity, what are the functional consequences?
Yeah, so you tell the story of small world networks, and then relate that within a network neuroscience perspective,
Right.
and it used to be thought, because small world, that's optimal for communication, and it used to be thought, you make the point in the book, that the brain is actually connected anatomically in a higher than small world order of magnitude.
Yeah.
And then, so what I want to ask you then, going back to that combinatorial anatomical connectivity is, what does that do for us, right? And is that where we shift into the functional connectivity story? Is that an advantage of being more highly, higher than small world network, more highly connected than small world network? Is that an easy way to shift into thinking about the importance of the functional connectivity?
Yeah, I think that small world the small world organization would already give a lot of those kinds of properties, because I think that's why it was so fundamental when Olaf Sporns and many others started suggesting this in the early 2000s. I think it was really fundamental because it really shows that even with a regular structure with a few random long-range connections, you start getting properties that all of a sudden emerge in this system that you would not have. And you get it from relatively few long-range random connections, and which changes drastically the space of functional relationships that are possible in this kind of architecture. I think if you take that one step further, so I don't have any problem with that, but I think that, again, it's empirical, right? So that's what we want it to be. We study the brain and we see how does the architecture look. And in my view, my reading of the literature, there's some challenges and questions there because of the strength of the connections and all sorts of nuances that we can't ignore. But my reading of the literature is that it's actually really more like a tiny world than a small world, in the sense that it's denser connectivity in the cortex. There's these highly structured large-scale loops, basal ganglia, cerebellum, amygdala, midbrain, that complement the cortical dense mesh of interconnections. So what I think it does is that it puts even more pressure, I think, on us to move to a space of functional relationships, because the anatomy is such that you can integrate and you can interact and integrate much more easily than we thought, because of the small world, or let's say this is correct, and this tiny world hypothesis is flies. And so if it does, then we really need to shift spaces, because the anatomy supports many different kinds of functions because of the ways of communication. It's highly efficient in ways that it wouldn't if it was piecemeal. I have to go to California via every single thing. It's a lot of steps that you have to take there. So it's gonna take weeks, months. I don't know that, when America went to the West, it was months, right? So it takes months. And if you have these shortcuts and these other ways of communicating, then it changes things dramatically. Relationships can occur that would not be able to occur otherwise in space and time.
There's time again. Principle 3, neurons as the main unit of the brain. Just kidding. Networks as functional units.
Well, that's a good point, because not too long ago, neurons were the unit. And I think, I don't know. I think that one has probably died, but I'm not sure. Yeah. But anyway,
so.
That's not our discussion here today. I think that putting all these things together, I think that really speaks to our need now in neuroscience to focus on circuits. So that unit becomes a circuit. And what are the principles of the circuits that form, and why does, let's say, the fusiform gyrus participate in certain circuits that support face recognition much more often than it participates in, perhaps, let's say, than other circuits that support other kinds of things. So that we have to work those things out. That has to do with their place in this whole anatomical space and many other kinds of things. Obviously, the sensory kinds of inputs that are more proximal and whatnot. But that's the kinds of questions that I think neuroscience should be focusing on.
Are you using circuits and networks synonymously in this case?
That is a problem that's a really good question, because I've used that synonymously in the past, and a lot of people do not like it. And I think I probably should be a little bit more careful, because I've exchanged them. And a lot of people view networks almost like perhaps more traditional fMRI networks, fMRI resting state networks.
Right.
I never really thought of it that way, because of course, it's very commonly used.
Circuits feels like closer to anatomical to me than networks.
Right. Actually, in fact, someone recently, in something that I submitted for publication, I think, was saying that it was very confusing. And I think they said the same thing. Maybe you reviewed the paper. That
they send them to me.
because I think by using circuits, I think it semantically connected in this person's mind, in this reviewer's mind, perhaps something much more structural that I didn't have in mind. So I don't know what the best word is then. I just don't know, because I was too casually using circuit very dynamically and very functionally, like these things forming dynamically as a circuit.
Yeah.
But if the readers, the listeners, everyone is interpreting this as something more anatomical and more rigid, then it's a really bad way of referring to them. And networks, I have had this pushback too, because I think networks is just, people are thinking, you're thinking about, and he also does some fMRI research. So he's always talking about these networks and these fMRI resting state networks, and some 2/3 of neuroscience, like, who cares about fMRI research? And I didn't mean it in that sense at all, of fMRI networks, of resting state networks. So I think my language there might have been really problematic. It's throwing people completely off. But I do mean, I've been using networks and circuits more or less interchangeably, and thinking of these highly dynamic, modifiable overlapping entities, communities, coalitions,
I wonder if you could use
clusters.
motif,
Motif, perhaps, yeah,
something
motifs.
like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So, but a motif, but it doesn't even require something like a circuit motif. But if you say a circuit motif, people think
Yeah.
more. That would almost sound more structural to me, right? Circuit motif.
Well, I
I
thought
don't know.
motif would give it more of a functional flavor, but
Yeah, yeah,
because
it could.
circuit sounds A
Yeah,
connects to B, but then motif is like, well, there's this family of them, kind of, or
yeah,
something.
yeah. I do. I
Okay.
do think that maybe we need some ways of conveying that if there really are these things that form more dynamically, that and this state, this in this time point, the amygdala is functionally linked with several other regions, and that shifts dynamically in behavior. Then I think we need to really use better words or qualify these words, and could be a little bit of explanation sometimes of the difficulty in communication, which happens in general with lots of these terms, right? Not to mention
Yeah.
these complicated terms like complexity and emergence and what have you. So what exactly do we mean, right?
Yeah.
And even in this more basic sense, I think that you might have just spotted something that it can be confusing. Yeah, I should be more careful in referring to these things, which I view as really very dynamic, yeah, and malleable.
All right, back on track, I suppose. We
Yeah,
have two more principles. Principle
okay.
4, interactions via cortical-subcortical loops. And, this is harking back to the thalamus and cortical-basal ganglia loops and the amygdala loops.
Yeah, so
Amygdala
that
loops.
really is a principle that is I could have ordered it slightly differently and linked it to the first principle, which is the backbone of connectivity. But I wanted to literally have a header there that a person would see separate on a piece of paper, and we really drive home this need to be really thinking about the cortical subcortical, but even in a more general sense, not just the forebrain subcortex, but everything below the cortex, midbrain and hindbrain with cerebellum, that it's really all this connectivity along the entire neural axis that happens to be vertical in humans and horizontal in many other animals, that we really should be considering, and not so much having the focus which we tend to do, I think, especially in my part of the world, which is more human oriented research, of cortex, and in fact deriving what are the principles of the brain's architecture just from looking at cortical connectivity. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes
Mm-hmm.
I both admire people who do that, and also it drives me crazy because, well, we can't isolate the cortex from all the other rest, all the rest. So how can we have even the courage of proposing that the brain architecture has these properties if we're not taking into account all that other kind of structural arrangements? So I wanted to have that as a separate heading because I really think it helps organize our thinking and moving away from just maybe connectivity between any given level, just calling level here, like a cortex, subcortex, midbrain, and just for
The
convenience
eye
sake.
roll. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So to break this tendency that we think mostly, how the subcortical regions maybe are interconnected, which is quite a lot of the animal work, right? The non-human animal research focuses a lot on subcortical structures for historical reasons and many reasons, and then the human work tends to focus a lot on the cortical regions. And so breaking a little bit this mode of thinking, I thought that I would have this as a separate principle.
So you describe, the differences between open loops and closed loops, and give examples of these types of loops in the brain, which I like the idea of there being a closed loop as separate from an open loop, but everything also comes in degrees. And would it be correct to say that the more we learn about anatomical connectivity, the more everything is actually an open loop?
No, I don't think necessarily so, because I mean that could be the way that things turn out empirically, but I do think that with newer methods, right? We're always evolving with methods, newer methods and new ways of doing these anatomical studies, and just redoing them is incredibly important, because we really we haven't had amazing breakthroughs in doing structural anatomy that have completely revolutionized things that compared to chemical injections and other kinds of more standard approaches that have been used for many decades. And so we're really still learning an incredible amount that we forget sometimes about that, but we're still really learning a lot about the architecture itself, the anatomy itself. So it really could come to having certain kinds of loops that happen to be more closed, more in a closed loop type of organization, in which the initial region projecting is the region that eventually receives back the return, if you will, projections, versus something that has quite a little bit more or quite a lot more of spread, indicating that I would support different kinds of functional relationships, right? That the segregation is clearly something that would be more functional segregation, would be clearly favored by more parallel isolated circuits, parallel circuits, than circuits that cross talk. And because the emphasis in the past has been a little bit more about their relative independence in the loops, I've tried to emphasize in the book that we have been learning quite a bit about the more interactive and overlapping nature of these loops than we thought perhaps a decade or two ago. And so appreciating that
But
I think is very important. But I do think it's something, it has to be the empirical outcome that we find out, okay, what we thought was more distributed was because we had some markers that were diffusing in ways that we didn't understand, and it's not so open loop after all. It's actually much more closed loop. Okay, great. So that's the organization, and then we have to move forward with that, with the understanding that we have at the time.
But just because something is closed loop, so at first blush, you might think, well, that argues more strongly for a modular view of the brain. But just because a loop is closed, it's not synonymous with modularity, because there's a lot of other interactions going on that are not part of the loop.
I completely agree, because that's interesting thing is that if we have this habit of doing these basal ganglia loops and these kind of other loops, we have this habit. It's a loop, right? But we have this habit of starting it in the cortex, which is but it's a loop, right? So we could have start somewhere else. But let's do the same thing and start at the cortex. And so if the loop was perfectly closed, right, onto this exact same neuron, let's say, if the loop is perfectly closed, as you said, it doesn't mean modular, because if that same neuron, again, if we're going to stick to a single neuron, is actually connected in many ways, it actually has the room for much more distributed processing and non-modular processing, even though these loops are closed. The closed loops tend to favor a little bit more segregated style of processing, I would say, but it doesn't preclude, it constrains more, I think, the kind of interaction of the signals. I do think that, I think that's the overall way that I think about anatomy, in enabling and constraining the types of relationships that are more natural. Because if I need to do something within a few seconds, I can't wait minutes for this thing to percolate and go 17 times around every single place in the brain. So obviously there are temporal constraints that in behavior, thankfully it's not all the time that animals and humans need to engage in something that is such time pressure, but there are those occasions where there are these kinds of behavioral requirements in time that have to be executed quite rapidly. You step on a brake and you have to stop immediately, or you catch something, or what have you. That these are many behaviors, not to mention more survival related behaviors that we watch on YouTube or what have you, that are incredibly time sensitive.
Does an open loop indicate higher complexity, or does it indicate a higher decoupling between our senses and motor actions? Not necessarily, I suppose.
I would. I mean, again, at the first pass, I would have to think more carefully. But I think that more open loops give more opportunities for more crosstalk, right? So, for instance, if there's a region that, for whatever reason, because of its receptor density, because of history of learning and other kinds of things, is very important for reward-related mechanisms, and this is part of some loop that is very open, it can be influenced by many things, and it can influence many other things. So it opens up the space of relationships, I think. I that's my first inclination, is to think that way. And so at least even in a rapid cycle of things, it has the ability to incorporate more things, right? Because it might be receiving signals from more diverse places that are that are sensitive to different aspects of the external and internal worlds, and thereby supporting more behavioral flexibility. Because if you're just sensitive to a certain class of signal, then I'm more tied to that class of signal. But if I can have more signals that, let's say, just for example, a more internal world and a more external world simultaneously, both worlds can, okay, do I go and fight? Well, but I was just injured, so it's not a good idea, right? So I was just attacked, and this pride of lions, and you've been attacked, and your leg is injured. The best behavior right now is to crouch and whatever, do behaviorally that is better, as opposed to striking back. And I think that these multiple elements of internal and external worlds having the ability to influence behavior, the open loops, my first inclination is to think that they support the faster versions of these kinds of relationships and these behaviors.
Okay, Luis, principle 5, and then we'll move on to some other topics here. And I'm curious, whether you felt if this one was just tacked on, but I know that this is near and dear to your heart also. Okay, principle 5, connectivity with the body.
Right. So connectivity with the body. I think that one of the weaknesses, to be honest, of the book is literally that I didn't develop as much the body into the book as I looking back, ideally, I should have, because I do think that brains being embodied is fundamental. Like, a lot of people have been talking about this for decades, and even more so in the past 5-10 years. So obviously there's no originality whatsoever there. I'm just saying the same thing that everyone is saying, that a lot of people have been saying. So, but I do think it's really a fundamental principle. And if later we get to talk about AI and certain things that AI needs to do, I would bring back the body, but that's for later maybe. Mm-hmm. But I do think that this close link of brain and body is really fundamental. And I think that because I wanted to have a book short, but the book was for a general audience, and I have professionally, to get grants and papers and whatnot, I have to put an end to the project. I think in a perfect world, I would have had a lot more on the body and really highlighting this aspect, which I think is fundamental. So in that sense, it might have felt, like you said, was it tacked on? So in that sense, it might have been appearing that way because of the lack of depth and integration of these ideas throughout the book. But I do think it's really fundamental. I really think that we're missing a lot by considering this as a disembodied organ, this brain that is just a brain, and that is not closely connected and communicating with an acting body, and in this embodiment. Yeah.
When you talk about interoception, but that also just links with behavior, which you stress, throughout the book as right. That's what it's all about anyway, is connecting brain and behavior.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
All right, we got through the 5 principles. So I want to just ask, the way that we've been talking is in terms of which regions are connected to which other regions, and the functional motifs. See, now I've got to use language, and it's awful.
Right.
But this is all like with neuronal connections and areas. When you think about these things, do you also think in terms of neuromodulators and within the context sensitivity, astrocytes, and those sorts of system level properties in combination with these principles of organization, and so on?
Yeah, I do think in those terms. I think it reflects my own lack of sufficient amount of knowledge, that I don't have a more comprehensive treatment in terms, broader terms, including astrocytes and this more in-depth discussions of neurotransmitter systems and their interactions and their combinations, and the way that's something that I could have explored and included in the book. But I do think that it's really critical and integral to understanding these systems, is that these systems exist in an architecture that is made even more flexible, even more powerful, given these modulations that these systems provide the system in ways that can engage large parts of the brain, can be more focal sometimes, and so it's really incredibly central to the story. I think that that's something that, if someone, I can't not envision this ever happening, but if they're an Entangled Brain version 2, then that's the direction that it should grow and develop and work out, and in what ways these aspects need to be integrated. I think that's really important.
So I don't want to make us go down a long path here, but you are very interested in connecting brain with behavior, and you argue about the complexity of behavior and needing to track that. And when I got into neuroscience, I was really interested in consciousness, whatever the hell that is, right?
Yeah.
And thinking and our mental world, essentially our subjective mental world. And I'm wondering if you feel like these principles of organization and these principles of complexity and so on, can we extend those? Well, here's the question: has this changed or made you think about our mental world in any different way, or do you feel like these principles can apply to the mental, and we can start to get a grasp on things that aren't "quote unquote" behavior?
Yeah, I do think I think that's clearly a part of the space that I don't explore in my thinking in general. It's something that I hear and that I read sometimes, and a lot of people are interested. A lot of people bring like language and other kinds of
Yeah.
human capabilities, at least with this level of how language is developed, how developed language is, and whatnot. Clearly is clearly the case. It's something that I don't bring into focus in my thinking or my focus of research, but it's something that I do think it's closely related. It has to be closely related to the aspects that we were discussing before. Essentially, very loose sense and kind of hand wavy way is there are all these higher order interactions that could afford some mental world and event and space that needs to be supported in some way, because it exists, and so we need to make progress along that direction. I often, like you said, in many of my papers, I bring these examples from threat processing and other kinds of more basic forms of behavior, even if they're highly complex, might involve certain kinds of, at least in the scenarios, like foraging scenarios, and how predator and prey and whatnot, in some of the discussions that I've written. But it doesn't approximate the type of many of the behaviors that many investigators and researchers are really interested in, right? So that gets to your question, where these mental world of imagination, of planning, of these levels upon levels of further decoupling of sensory stimulation and current state of the body and the mental, the content of some mental augmentation. And so it's something that I don't have, that I haven't investigated or thought deeply enough by any means. Yeah.
So let's move on to talk about, and this is kind of related, emotion. Although you have been interested in the connection between cognition and emotion, but I suppose you mainly focus on the behaviors related to emotion. So let's talk about emotion, and then I want to bring in AI before we get to some extra time for Patreon listeners. I just want your take on how the concept of emotion has sort of historically evolved, right? As we've learned more, so it used to be emotion is in the amygdala or subcortex, right? Or something like that. And now we have a much more nuanced view of it. So how have we come to appreciate emotion in the modern sense based on its historical context?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question or theme, which is historically. So one of the central ideas in emotion research pertaining to the brain is the existence, the suggestion of the existence of a specialized circuit for emotion, and even more so than a specialized circuit, let's say a more structural circuit, a more structural, defined and constrained circuit for emotion. Not only that was a major theme, but the presence or the existence, I should say, of a specific brain region, let's say the hypothalamus, as the centerpiece of this little structural circuit for emotion. And so historically, that has been something that has always been emphasized. And I think to a good extent, it still informs a lot of the debate that there is specificity in the structural circuit, a set of regions that are involved. And there are some really heavy players, hypothalamus, amygdala, and so on, periaqueductal gray, and some other favorites of depending on the focus of a research group. But so in the animal world, there's still in the animal research, non-human animal research, there's still a lot of emphasis on these players. But I think in the past 2 decades or so, with research in humans, fMRI to a good extent, but I think more broadly even conceived, it really has informed, perhaps a strongly initial push was Antonio Damasio's Descartes' error, to really suggest that these systems at the very least are interacting with other things like perception and cognition in really important ways. That, for instance, decision making is a cognitive emotional process, like let's say somatic marker hypothesis by Damasio and colleagues, and so on. So I think that really broadened the scope of thinking about emotion in the brain, the emotional brain, in the past 2 decades. And I think that is permeating even a little bit into the rodent literature. For instance, a lot of investigators have been now, some investigators, I should say, are now looking at the role of the anterior insula. And
right.
I should say that in the rodent, the roles of the medial prefrontal cortex, that part of cortex has been there for quite some time, but not a broader view of more players, as perhaps in the case of the human research. So I guess in summary, I think what we're observing is that it's becoming more natural for people to think of, at the very least, more interactions between these cognitive emotional systems, cognitive action systems, cognitive perceptual systems. I mean, as you know, my push is to kind of dissolve these boundaries, or heavily blur, at the very, very least, heavily blur these boundaries. But I think that there's a wider appreciation of this, at the very least, of the interactions between these systems. So I think emotion research has really evolved tremendously in the past 30 years or 25 years in that direction, that the circuits are becoming really hard to you look at these reviews, and the circuits now have a dozen or 2 dozen regions. And if we looked at it, if we actually be interesting, the number of regions per year or per decade, plot in a graph, and people were probably looking at 2 or 3 regions, and now they're showing reviews with really complex, really fascinating set of regions interacting in complex ways for fear learning, fear extinction, and their relationships and whatnot. Steve Marin has a review paper. It's really fascinating. It's like a 70-page review, and has these very large, these growing circuits now that are becoming more mainstream in neuroscience. So I think that it's really important that this direction of it's not these isolated units anymore. It's the opposite of isolating, right? It's bringing together with the rest, and I think that
But we still draw it though as kind of units connected to units, And is there a way around that? I mean, so you've written a paper where you have kind of you've diagrammed out a functional, emotional, integrative kind of circuit, and that's not so much the box and arrow version. So
yeah, I think another thing that you were speaking about, learning how to use language in different ways, or learning to do science in a way that it's more or less it's less context dependent. I think another important direction for us as a field, and perhaps other fields, is to learn to do science that is less boxes and arrows, right? So somehow, if we could, because we have to draw these, and I think if we let go of these ways in which we draw things, I think that would be a huge advance already. And not only we have to draw things, but sometimes we have to put labels, because we're just trying to summarize. We're trying to do dimensionality reduction on the paper, right? And so we put one word there, but then if we do that one word, we ruined everything, right? Because, okay, that's not what we meant, or maybe we did mean that it was just that word, but is that what you really meant? Or you meant, I don't know, what did you mean exactly? So, but I think that dimensionality reduction is so extreme that how do we go? I mean, we can't have a plot with a cloud of a word cloud around, surrounding and rotating and spinning. I don't know, but but is that a problem? Sometimes I do think so, that I just don't want to even do a figure, because it's just going to ruin the whole idea.
It limits the concept conveyed. Yeah.
And that's the concept that we're conveying. And obviously, we're not going to, perhaps there are other ways that are even available now, but for a regular small lab, completely beyond anyone's means, to generate a movie to explain some of these ideas in some complex computer graphics manipulation.
Wear 3D glasses. Yeah. Maybe the IMAX movies for every paper. Yeah.
Some visualization that is super fancy. Perhaps that even exists, but we don't. That science is not like that yet. Perhaps it needs to be a little bit more.
Maybe when we develop AGI, we can just tell them to do that for us, right? But will they have emotions? So you've written that there's a need for artificial intelligence to incorporate emotions. How's that for a segue, by the way? That's pretty good.
That is a good one. That's a perfect one. I do think that if we want to, of course, we can have a computer science, we can have artificial intelligence that is completely different from how humans do things. It's fine, right? So we do obviously complex mathematics that is not just how we, or logic or what have you. It's not the way we reason. It's completely fine. It's not. There's nothing inconsistent with trying ways of formalizing knowledge systems or artificial intelligence in ways that are completely different. But if we want to solve problems that are similar to what embodied animals solve in intelligent ways, I think we need to solve a couple of problems that bring us to emotion. And here's my way of thinking. My way of thinking is that, like, let's say we think, to make this concrete, and this is how it helps me, is to think about a robot, right? So a robot has a brain, and it moves around. And so if it does that, we would like to send to, perhaps Mars is not a good analogy anymore because of things that I won't even want to get into, but we want to send some expedition, some spacecraft to another planet or some other
Alpha Centauri, something. Yeah.
Right. So we need to solve it needs to be an autonomous agent, right? It needs to survive to be autonomous. So I think the problem to be solved for the kinds of intelligence that we engage in and other animals engage in, there might be other kinds of intelligence that are fascinating as well. But these kinds of intelligence really requires us to solve the behavioral autonomy problem, which is how do you build a system that is completely autonomous and can behave flexibly and intelligently in complex, unpredictable worlds, so that the rules are completely they're flexible enough that they pose sufficient challenges to an agent. So in that setting, I think that we really need to have agents that can have both motivation and emotion, in the sense of learning what is of biological significance. In that case, obviously not biological. So, but what we call biological significance. In that case, for agent, it's significant to the agent that it needs to conserve some kind of energy because its battery will run out, and it needs to find some source of what have you, some source of some nutrient or I don't know what, and it needs to navigate in certain ways. So certain things have value in that way because of the integrity of the agent that will not be maintained if it does not consider those factors. So I think emotion and motivation come very naturally to organize behavior, even behavior that is thought to be, historically has been thought to be independent of these factors, not necessarily perception, planning, and in general problem solving have to incorporate these factors. And I think these factors are incorporated in ways that we call emotion and emotion and motivation in biological systems. And so that's a label. We can call it whatever we want, and it's a label. I think it's a really a way of summarizing the existential and survivals in the survival sense of agents that exist in a flexible and unpredictable world of limited resources, right? So you can't just turn yourself off and beam some new energy source and then you turn yourself back on. It turns you back on. It's something that in these kinds of scenarios, I think it has to be solved, perhaps to navigate worlds that are not limited by factors such as space and time in ways that biology faces, and limited resources. Perhaps the games kind of change, and so maybe we can get by with many kind of other architectures, and maybe it will surprise us that we can get a lot more done by just brute force, right? We have such astronomical computational power now compared to what we had 50 years ago. I mean, what was going to happen in 50 years? So if we have a lot of the problems that we've been solving in many ways are largely driven by computational power, right? It's like brute force in the sense that we have, I don't know, have 1 trillion parameters, and we have unlimited energy, and we have time in our hands. And so maybe that's going to be available. And if that's available, then we don't need a solution that functions on whatever I have no idea if it's a reliable estimate of whatever number of watts the brain consumes per unit of time.
It's exactly 20.
Yeah, exactly 20, right? So it is not going to work on that kind of setting. But who cares if that's not the setting in which the things are operating? But I think that in many problems that involve autonomy, that will have to be part of the solution, or at the very least, that would be really useful, a really useful part of the solution, I believe. At least my take on this.
One of the things that you just mentioned a moment ago is, it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's a label, right? And let's say the word emotion, maybe what we should have said sort of, up ahead is we've been talking about how the modular view of the brain should sort of dissipate and eventually allow this other way of thinking that we've been discussing here. But, are we still comfortable using the word emotion? Because that word itself, it has a conceptual space that historically, at least in Western culture, is associated with things like weakness or frivolity or non-usefulness. But as we learn more about, let's say the emotional circuit motifs and the integration of emotion with cognition and its importance, does that change our conception of emotion enough? Or do we, those boundaries of concepts, do they need to be kind of blurred as well?
I think that's a really great point. I really like that, because I think it has been changing, right? So I think that, when you started saying this, it took me a fraction of a second to update things. And so, yeah, of course you're right, because historically that's how emotion has been conceptualized in literature and in society. But I do think that in the past 30, 40 years, I guess it's, let's say 30 years with books by Joe Ledoux and by Damasio and by many others, I do think that it's actually going, and it could be going. I'm not sure. That's a great question, actually. I think it could be going in a way that is changing the way that we see it, and see it in a way that, for instance, if we take some of the, let's say, just say the Damasio ideas, that is integral to decision making. So it becomes, the connotation becomes very different, right? And so we start thinking of it as an intelligent thing to do. And so if you were to eliminate that factor that is so important, determining, am I going to go all the way to the US, to Boston, to do a PhD, and I'm going to leave all my family, all my friends here back in this other country? I mean, the flight is super long. As I am a graduate student, have no money. There's not going to, I'm maximum one time a year I'm going to be able to see. I mean, the decision there is humans, at least, is highly complex, right? It's not just, I'm going to increase my knowledge of artificial neural networks and computational neuroscience. It's so that way of deciding, insofar as we think that it is it's improves some kinds of decision making. Obviously, some kinds of decision making are not improved by
right.
how humans fail miserably. I think it's pretty obvious in ways of using types of decision making that are influenced by factors that are clearly detrimental, at least if we think of some greater good of all the beings on the planet, as opposed to a small subgroup. But if we think that is beneficial in some context, then I do think it shifts the boundaries of the concepts themselves, and we start thinking of start valuing people who have, I don't know, let's call it I don't even know exactly how it's conceptualized, but call it emotional intelligence or what have you. I don't, so
what about emotional train wrecks? What should we do with those people?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So it is messy.
We talked about emotion and its usefulness in artificial systems, but what about the other kind of principles that we've been talking about that you write about in your book? Do you think that the AI world, let's say, is appreciating these kinds of principles that are being more appreciated and more discovered in our brains? The interactions between systems, the loops and the openness and closedness of loops. I mean, do these principles need to be built into AI? And do you think they're being appreciated enough?
I do. I don't think they're appreciated enough. And I think it's fine. I should put it this way. I think, we have finite resources. And so if you want to stick to one style of computation, if you will, it's fine. Mm-hmm. Let's build things that have these abstract parameterizations and transformers and whatnot, that we can build things and understand the underlying mathematics eventually and do things. or what have you. You can have one style of doing things. It's I think it's fine, but I think that what I find very interesting is that some groups are starting to pay attention. One group that always comes to mind is a large group, so don't need to name any specific. In Montreal, to me, pops to mind as a
Yep.
hub of people who kind of integrating these ideas much more strongly than perhaps, I mean, as an outsider, so I could be wrong, but it feels to me that I'm always hearing something from those groups, so many groups, that becomes a hub for thinking about how can neuroscience kind of give us some architectural ideas or themes or motifs that can be interesting. So, okay, so I don't have just one recurrent neural network, one RNN, but I have multiple RNNs, and okay, and now I have to work out how they're going to interact. And so I think it opens the space of architectures in ways that I, as a completely aficionado about the brain, find fascinating, because I want to understand in what ways maybe some of these principles could open up ways of thinking about distributed processing computation more generally. And I think that it could turn out that they turn out to be very beneficial for AI, for let's say general intelligence. And it could, right? So I just don't know, because it could be the system could benefit from some of these things, but only modestly, unless we take it to a much more further elements of the architecture, and perhaps the embodiment, and even the fact that animals have mammals have a really long development phase. They spend years, many, it's not just humans, that they wouldn't be able to survive on their own by any means. So it's a really different kind of solution to this problem, right? Create something that depends on supervision, not in the supervised learning sense, but on someone literally taking care of it for years. So what if that is part of a really important type of solution that evolved? And so we don't know, but I think that to me, as a basic scientist, and with my origins in computer science, I'd be fascinating if we had more space to investigate those things too. That I find extremely attractive, that type of scenario, just to understand. Not necessarily, I'm a little more skeptical about, to put it mildly, sometimes I'm more skeptical about the ways in which these architectures will inform us about the brain, but I view them more as abstract architectures that we would gain a lot to understand, even from a computer science, or call it whatever discipline. I mean, again, names of disciplines are this one thing that useless.
Dissolve everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I was in the computer science department, and I liked biology. I mean, I'm a psychology department. I didn't have a psychology class. And so, for me, it doesn't work. But I think it would be so fascinating to study these kinds of things. And if they can inform the brain, inform our understanding of the brain, so much the better. I think that I'm open to that possibility as well, as long as it's a real collaboration, right? People are really interested in really understanding these systems, and real interdisciplinary collaboration, multidisciplinary. So I really want to understand the biology and the behavior, and I also want to understand the computational principles, distributed processing, parallel distributed processing types of architectures, and how these things communicate, interact with each other at a high level, at a broader level, conceptual level, but with the details of the disciplines, right? It's the same that if someone gets into this and doesn't know underlying computer architecture and distributed systems, doesn't know that. It's a little separate from AI. I'm just talking even more broadly now.
Yep.
So I think that these true collaborations, I think would be fascinating. So I think there's a lot of room for those. And I think that, so I mean, just literally yesterday, I bumped into a paper saying what happens to, I don't even know what it exactly means. I have to read it. It's like, what happens to a spatially constrained, I don't know if you saw it, it was literally a spatially constrained RNN. And so let's use another word. What happens to a spatially constrained RNN, recurrent neural network, when it literally is spatially constrained? So it's inside, it's not just an abstract.
Oh.
So I literally have to, I was like, okay, I bookmarked it. I want to read it. I want to see what it is. So if you start putting physical constraint to the number of connections or the size, or I don't even know what they exactly did, but they had a thread on Mastodon, and it seemed fascinating because they were saying that we're finding all sorts of things that happen when you spatially constrain an RNN.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
I vaguely remember this, but maybe it was like a year ago or something.
Okay, maybe there was another version, or an early. Maybe it got published now, and it was like for the first preprint.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. And I noticed literally just yesterday. I think it was still a preprint yesterday, but in fact, I'll just send you the link. But
please do.
I just as an example, the kinds of things, right? So, and that's why I find it so fascinating. I want to put brains. I mean, if we could clone ourselves, right, and have multiple careers at the same time, it's like working in robotics. And put a physical, what if we build this thing and this thing has to navigate in the world, right?
Oh.
So yeah. What do we learn from doing that? So my suggestion is that cognitive emotional interactions have to be integral to this architecture. The cognitive emotion integration has to be integral to this architecture, and not something that is kind of you have a traditional cognitive architecture and you add a layer that you call emotion because it has some kind of neuromodulatory low pass thing that tracks, how many positive and how many negative things happen in its past 1 hour, and it modulates a little bit how fast it moves or how fast it answers a question. I don't think that's the way to go. I think that has to be much more integrated. And I think that offers a lot more room for diversity of processing than the segregated view. But again, that's obviously something that it's not, in this case, it's not empirical. You have to construct and compare compete the two types of architectures and see what they end up doing.
So believe me, I would rather spend another half hour with you than go do what I'm about to do, which is try to teach children things, guitar and such. But anyway, I've got to go be a parent, and I've taken you long enough as well. But Luiz, I really, I didn't say this up front, but I really enjoyed the book. And I think it's a great book, especially for a more general audience, more general readership, because many of the books that I read, that people I have on the podcast is a little more specialized. So I think you really hit the nail on the head there. So congratulations on that. Looking forward to Entangled Part 2 when that comes out. And I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks.
Well, thanks so much. That means a lot. Thanks so much. I had great fun. Thank you.
I alone produce Brain Inspired. If you value this podcast, consider supporting it through Patreon to access full versions of all the episodes and to join our Discord community. Or if you want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, consider signing up for my online course, Neuro AI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. You're hearing music by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.